Good morning, boys and girls. So it's Mr. Schwally here with another edition of our westward journey. This one we are specializing in the Lewis and Clark expedition, one of my favorite parts of American history. Anyway, we've heard about this a lot so far, but today I'm going to read you guys a little book about it. But before we go on, this is what it involved. This area over here in the west, and they went all the way from the Mississippi River, right there, and then they traveled all the way to the Pacific Ocean. All right, so, oh, wrong side. From here, the Mississippi, and they went up the Missouri, and then over all the way to Columbia River at the border of Oregon and Washington. So let's read a little bit about this journey and all that came along with it. All right. Book is The Lewis and Clark Expedition. You'll have access to this as you guys work on your wagon ride project. All right, let's see how much I can get through with this. All right, The Lewis and Clark Expedition. A young country. All right, here we go. In 1803, the United States was just 27 years old. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, was the third president of the young country. He was an intelligent president, eager for the country to grow. Known as a man of the people, Jefferson was well liked by most Americans. On April 30th, 1803, the United States, led by Thomas Jefferson, bought a large piece of land from France for about $15 million. That was that section in the globe I was talking about. The deal was called the Louisiana Purchase. It included land west of the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, that whole area here. Okay. The new land stretched from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Canadian border. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. Planning and expeditions. This was a big deal, all right? There's all this new land. There was a lot to find out what was out there for Americans. President Jefferson had big plans for the country's new land. He wanted to send an expedition to explore the area. He wanted to see if there was a water route between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. If such a water route existed, American traders could travel west to trade fur. Jefferson also felt the land west of the Rocky Mountains, called Oregon Territory, would someday eventually belong to the United States. Then the country would reach from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. With all that land, the young country would surely become a great and powerful nation. Crossing thousands of miles of unmapped land and dealing with Native Americans would be a great challenge. Thomas Jefferson knew he needed intelligent, brave people to lead this expedition. The expedition would be called the Corps of Discovery. The head of the Corps of Discovery, Jefferson chose his personal secretary, former U.S. Army officer Meriwether Lewis. Lewis was a skilled outdoorsman. Honored to be chosen, Lewis was eager to begin the trip. He was 30 years old when the expedition began. Lewis asked his best friend William Clark to join him. William Clark had also served in the U.S. Army. He also had experience in the wilderness. He was 34 years old, preparing for the expedition. So think about this as you guys are preparing for your expeditions or your Oregon Trail route. Think about what they had to go through. They didn't even know what was in front of them. At least the Oregon Trail people had an idea. These guys had a plan, not knowing anything. No roads, nothing. It was all new to them. In the winter of 1803, Lewis and Clark set up camp on the Mississippi River near St. Louis, Missouri. It was here that the group of about 40 men began training and planning for the trip. The oldest was 35 and the youngest was about 17. They built boats, got lots of exercise, and practiced shooting. They packed supplies, including food, medicine, tools, and rifles. The leaders of the group knew that many dangers lay ahead of them. They would have to deal with many Native American groups. If they could make friends with them, the Native Americans might share their knowledge of the land. So the men packed gifts such as beads, mirrors, pipes, knives, handkerchiefs, and belts. Members of the expedition knew about hunting, steering down rivers, blacksmithing, making guns and bullets, and surviving in the wilderness. There was only one African American on the expedition. His name was York, William Clark's slave at the time. The start of the expedition. So now think about, these guys are about to set on. They don't know how much land's in front of them. They know there's a lot, but they don't know what dangers lie ahead. They don't know if they're going to make it back. The Lewis and Clark expedition left St. Louis on May 14th, 1804. The weather was fair and there was a gentle breeze. They traveled in 3 boats. The largest was a 55-foot long keel boat with 1 sail. Keel boat is a large wooden river boat with a cabin built in the center. It needed 22 men to row it. The other 2 boats were perigos. The smaller boats were like canoes. One used 71 oars, the other only 6. Okay. I want you to remember, they're going upstream. Okay. They're going up the Mississippi and then up the Missouri. Upstream. That's not an easy task. The expedition also brought 2 horses, which were led along the riverbanks. The men planned to use them for hunting when food was in short supply. So while they're going up, they a lot of times had men on land who are following them along the river. Here is the map, okay? As you'll see, they start in Mississippi and then follow that Missouri all the way up, which eventually turns the Yellowstone River and goes to the area known as Yellowstone Park today. The original plan was to travel northwest along the Missouri River and reach the Rocky Mountains within about 7 months by the winter of 1804. From there, they would cross what they thought was a short pass to the Columbia River. Nothing's that easy. Which would lead them to the Pacific Ocean by the spring of 1805. They planned to be back in St. Louis by the fall of 1805. We'll see how that goes. The trip was to take about a year and a half. However, it actually took Lewis and Clark more than 2 years and 4 months. They had no idea how huge the mountain ranges were. Northwest travel along the Missouri River turned out to be more difficult than the leaders expected. The men had to deal with tree branches and rocks in the water. Mosquitoes and ticks plagued them. Only the smoke from campfires and smearing themselves with grease helped this problem. Wow. Both Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were excellent leaders and outdoorsmen, but they were very different in nature. Clark loved to talk and tell jokes. He usually supervised the boats. Now, Lewis was different. He was a very serious man and sometimes suffered from depression. Preferring to be alone, Lewis walked and explored the banks of the Missouri River with his dog, Seaman. By August, the expedition had reached South Dakota. Buffalo were plentiful on the plains. They hunted and ate their first buffalo on August 23rd. They also enjoyed turkeys, geese, beaver, and fish. Lewis and Clark kept detailed records for President Jefferson. They wrote down information about the land, Native Americans, weather, animals, plants, and attitudes of the men. The animals of the plains included coyote, prairie dogs, jackrabbits, and a kind of goat called a pronghorn, creatures that men had never seen before. All right, so a lot of these animals aren't around in the East or even the Midwest. So it's the first time seeing some of these animals. Meeting Native Americans. Now, this was always a challenge. You want to start with peace, okay, because no one benefits from fighting back and forth. So that's why they brought those gifts, right? All right, meeting Native Americans. During August, the expedition met some Ottawa and Missouri people. Many of the Plains Indians lived in this large grassland region. The Ottawa and Missouri were friendly. However, the men soon met the Sioux, who were not so friendly. Even President Jefferson's message of peace offended them. The Sioux accepted the gifts, but the gifts caused problems too. All right, now look at it from the Sioux's perspective. How do they know they're going to trust these people? All right, they've been coming through here, and they have every right to believe they're going to take their land, which they did. One Sioux chief felt that he didn't get enough and tried to take one of the expedition's boats. On shore were 100 of his men ready to fire bows and arrows. Lewis shouted to his men to aim their guns. Fortunately, the Sioux left. By November, the explorers were in central North Dakota, home of the Mandan people. Mandan people were pleased with their gifts. The two groups made friends and smoked a peace pipe together. Now, they would give them some very key information. Because of the cold climate, the expedition decided to stay there until spring. So they spent that winter there. They built a fort and called it Fort Mandan, which is still around. Over the winter months, the men learned much about the Native American way of life and the land ahead. All right, so they're kind of getting the lay of the land as they go up there. And then, very key, a woman named Sacagawea. In April 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition left Fort Mandan. The Mandan gave them a great send-off. They sang, danced, and exchanged gifts. Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trapper who lived among the Native Americans, joined the expedition. He would guide the expedition over the mountains and help the group communicate with the Native Americans. Charbonneau was married to a young Shoshone girl named Sacagawea. The Shoshone lived near the Rocky Mountains and had many horses. When Sacagawea was about 10, the Minnetree captured her and took her from her family. So that was another Native American tribe. The Sacagawea was sold. Then Sacagawea was sold as a slave to Charbonneau, who made her one of his wives. Sacagawea and their 2-month-old baby boy named Pomp joined the expedition too. Can you imagine? Some of you got like 2-year-old, 2-month-old brothers or sisters. Can you imagine a little guy like that on this expedition? Perhaps Sacagawea would help the expedition get the horses they needed from the Shoshone. As it turned out, the young Shoshone girl contributed greatly to the Corps of Discovery. The expedition now had 2 large pirogues and 6 small canoes. They sent the keelboat back downriver to St. Louis. Remember, that was huge. They weren't going to do much with it. It was over 50 feet long. It's not like they're going to bring that over the mountains. The boat carried letters back to President Jefferson about the journey, as well as samples of the animal and plant life discovered on the plains. On May 14th, 1805, exactly 1 year into the trip, a storm came up suddenly. One of the pirogues almost overturned when Charbonneau panicked. However, Sacagawea stayed calm and saved items that had been washed overboard. She was brave, including even some of the journals that they were using, which provided key information for President Jefferson. All right, continue. A fork in the river. I think we'll stop at this point and then we'll continue at another time. Okay, so this is decision-making time. All right, they reach a fork in the river. They have to decide which route to go. On June 3rd, 1805, the group came to a fork in the river. Which of these was the Missouri? Which would lead them to the Great Falls? Taking the wrong fork would mean losing valuable time. Lewis and Clark sent out teams to study each of the streams. They saw large green plains with herds of buffalo, elk, antelopes, and wolves. They could also see mountains. Some of them were covered with snow. Finally, after much thought, they chose one of the forks in the river. On about June 13th, they reached the Great Falls in Montana. They had chosen the right stream. The region was familiar to Sacagawea, who had once lived on this land, the home of the Shoshone. Obviously, they could not take the boats through the falls. They used cottonwood and willow trees to build trucks with wheels to carry the boats overland. It took about a month, so think about that. They had to bring all those boats overland. Soon after, Sacagawea became dangerously ill. Clark nursed her back to health. Lewis, too, became very ill. He boiled the twigs of a plant he described as the choke cherry. Then he drank the strong black liquid. After only 2 doses, his fever went down, and he was no longer in pain. The group often came across wild animals. A brown bear once chased Lewis for 80 yards. Lewis finally ran into the river, and the bear decided not to follow him. All right, so we're going to stop at this point, and until next time, we're at another decision. All right, boys and girls. Until next time, and then we'll finish up with this. All right, take care.